Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the first introductory lecture on Tristram Shandy, one of the, let us put it, one of the maverick works of literature, one of the first works of metafiction in English, in the English novel, and probably a typical novel, one of the most typical novels of world literature. Now, why do I say so? Who was Sterne, and why did he write Tristram Shandy? Now, one of the most important things for you to note is that this novel was published, and let me share a few things with you on a PowerPoint that will probably help me and help you to understand who Sterne was. I hope this is visible. This is the man, Lawrence Sterne. Sterne, by the way, was a pastor in the sense he was part of the clergy. And therefore, it's very interesting that one of the most ribald texts, one of the most subversive texts of British literature was written by a man who was himself a pastor. Now, Sterne lived in a village called Coxwold in Yorkshire. And this house was to be the model of the place where the characters stay and where the novel is located, Shandy Hall. Now, this is one of the pictures of Shandy Hall of contemporary of that age. This is the picture of Shandy Hall when I visited Shandy Hall, and I was very fortunate in actually taking a look at some of Sterne's original manuscripts. But this is the what is called. Please just follow this. This is called the Bowling Green, where the character called Uncle Toby will lay his model of the siege of Namur. So, a clay model of a war. This is the Bowling Green. This is the parlor where the major characters assemble. Tristram's father, Walter Shandy, Tristram's uncle, Uncle Toby. There is, of course, Uncle Toby's assistant, Corporal Trim. There is the maid Obadiah, and there is Tristram's mother, Mrs. Shandy. You also have the figure of the obstetrician who comes to deliver, Tristram. His name is Dr. Slop, who is a character of the text. And you have another character who lives adjacent to the Shandys, that is Widow Wadman. Now, Uncle Toby has been wounded in the siege of Namur. He was a soldier. So, Widow Wadman is very curious to know where Uncle Toby has been wounded, obviously referring to the groin region. Uncle Toby, who is very innocent and sentimental, thinks that Widow Wadman wants to know where in the siege of Namur, at which location he was wounded. So he tries to show her the exact place on the Bowling Green. These are the characters of Tristram Shandy. And the entire incident in Tristram Shandy is about the birth of Tristram, the coming of Dr. Slop, the ramblings of Walter Shandy and Uncle Toby, the interactions between Toby and Wadman, the death of a soldier called Lefevre, and the novel is about the growth of Tristram. But everything is in a random pattern because the novel begins with Tristram's father and mother having sex so that they can conceive Tristram. Then it moves randomly forwards. Then it moves backwards. So there's no linear pattern of growth. See, in Tom Jones, we looked at what we call the Bildungsroman, which moved in deliberate sequences of time. So, clock time and narrative time were more or less moving in the same direction. But in Tristram Shandy, clock time and narrative time, clock time is linear, narrative time is haphazard. So when the novel ends, Tristram is just 2.5 years old. But within the novel, he has grown old and his locks have turned grey. So the novel is playing around with the notion of time, space, plot, character, and so on and so forth. You see, you have to remember that this is 1760 when the first volume was published. It was published in 9 volumes, and Sterne was writing almost, say, if you take 1760, 11 years after Tom Jones was being written, when the realist novel had more or less made its features known. So within 11 years of the major realist novel, Tristram Shandy was deconstructing the pattern to lay the basis for what we will call the first metafictional novel in English literature. Now, what is metafiction? This is very critical for you to know that the agreement that the author has with the reader in realist fiction is that the reader will believe what the author is showing is true. So, as it were, fiction is like a lens. Words are like a lens through which the reality can be presented to the reader. Now, this is what the verite realisme, a term coined by Rembrandt, suggests about realist fiction. Actuality of time, place, and character, proper names, actual events, rooted in history, linear structures. These are some of the figures of, or some of the features of the realist novel. But there are a group of novels which show us how the art of the novel is practiced, how the author writes fiction. So these novels are not about plot, but about how the writer is constructing the plot. One of the earliest examples of this is, of course, the burlesque piece of fiction called Don Quixote by Cervantes. Now, in using the burlesque, Cervantes is making fun of how the romance is created as an unreal form. Now, you have to also remember the work of Ferdinand the Saussure here, who suggested that words are merely reference. Saussure, for example, would say that, the word cat, for example, has nothing to mean, CAT. It is only because we ascribe a certain degree of meaning to this CAT, cat, that we can visualize this animal. So, words in themselves do not have any meaning. It is only when we agree, then that meaning is generated. Similarly, when you read a fiction, say when you read a detective story, you have a certain pattern to follow. You understand this is the detective, these are the clues, this is the crime, that is the resolution, that is the justice. So it's like a game. But when the metafictional writer writes, he shows you how the author is constructing the novel. And therefore, in doing so, he shows how all fictions are basically unreal and fictional rather than slices of real life. Now, when you read Tom Jones, you read it as Tom Jones's life. But what Tristram Shandy will do, or what Sterne will do in Tristram Shandy, is he will deliberately break the mold. He will deliberately thwart your expectations of plot and character and force you to understand how the author is creating the fiction. This is what is called metafiction. Now, metafiction as a term was coined as late as 1970 and was defined by the critic Patricia Waugh, Waugh, as a fiction that sits on the border between fiction and criticism and refers to the self referentiality of fiction. Self referentiality of fiction. So it's a fiction that refers to its own writing. So you can say that metafiction, as a critical term, is relatively postmodern. But within the growth of the novel or within the rise of the novel, there were metafictional energies. Why? Because nobody was sure what was happening. What was this new province of writing? And therefore, critical interrogation on this form started with the rise of the novel itself. What I'm trying to suggest is that the period between 1720 and say 1708 is the period when the novel is gradually distinguishing itself from the different competing prose narratives. As we saw in Tom Jones, it was borrowing copiously. At the same time, the authors were theorizing on how they were constructing this new province of writing. And therefore, by 1750, there was a consensus about how the realist fiction would progress. What Sterne is going to do is upset the apple cart. Is comically showing you how the writer is progressing, how the book is made out of pages, pages are made out of words, and therefore forcing you to see this as what it is, a work of fiction, a book which is a book and not life. Therefore, you see, this becomes part and parcel of what I will call, in critical parlance, or not what I will call, but Victor Shklovsky calls, Victor Shklovsky, Shlovsky, who was a well-known Russian formalist critic writing in the first half of the 20th century. Victor Shklovsky says that these works engage in a process of, he used the Russian word ostraniny, or defamiliarization. We're all very familiar with the way in which fiction operates. Whenever there is a disruption, whenever somebody is trying to tell you how this is happening, then what happens is a process of disruption, defamiliarization. Sterne, in Tristram Shandy, is engaging in this particular art of defamiliarization. He's defamiliarizing the technique in which the early novel is creating a realist paradigm. That is where you see the importance of Tristram Shandy lies. It is the first, in that sense, experimental novel. If you are interested, you see, you can read two books. One is titled The Great Tradition, which talks about the way in which classic realist novels have emerged. And the other is The Other Great Tradition, or novels which have interrogated the way in which realism has been depicted. Right? So the great tradition and the other great tradition. So if the novel has had a realist progress, then there has been a concurrent tradition within the novel which has interrogated the way in which it has sort of uh, represented or has created this illusion of realism. So, what finally does metafiction do? It highlights the work's status as a work of art, its artificiality, and the mechanisms through which the author creates this piece or work of art. Let me go through the other pictures also. This is the hearth in which, once again, the parlor in which Uncle Toby, Walter Shandy would have sat. This is Coxwell Church, where Sterne actually preached. And let me just return to the composition of Tristram Shandy. Now, in 1760, Sterne was a pastor in Coxwell Church. And please remember that when I visited Yorkshire and Coxwell, there's one bus or a maximum of two or three buses which ply all around the day. It's pretty in the interior of Yorkshire. So Sterne would take his manuscript and travel to London, where he actually met quite a number of major writers of the period. He was familiar with them, and he printed Tristram Shandy. Now, interestingly, Tristram Shandy became a runaway bestseller. So Sterne said, I wrote not to be fed, but to be famous, as it were. Now, once book one was published, then there was a clamor for more books. And between 1760 and 69, 9 books were published at various intervals. Right? So Tristram Shandy actually is composed of 9 books. But during this entire period, Sterne was extremely ill with sciatica, tremendous pain, and death. No, he was also suffering from tuberculosis and was looking at imminent death. And therefore, the last 2 books were written under the shadow of death. Right? That we have to remember. Also, interestingly, Tristram Shandy had many illustrations, blank pages, black pages, graphs of plots. So there was a lot of visual content, marble pages. There was a lot of visual content within the novel also. Right? The other thing we also need to remember while we are looking at Sterne is that, Shandy Hall is created as a quaint escape from reality. So Sterne is, as it were, creating a niche where he can explore the ways in which fiction is being written. I repeat, he's creating a niche where he is creating the zone where the art of writing and reading fiction can be explored. Sterne was, of course, to write a few other letters and publish them called Letters to Eliza, and he was to publish one last travelogue called The Sentimental Journey. So it was not as if Sterne had a very prolific kind of a repertoire, as it were, literary career, but this one novel made him immensely famous. Now, what did Sterne challenge? As I repeated, and I repeat the plot, that the plot is located in Shandy Hall. You have the beginning, which is called the ab ovo beginning, where it begins at the beginning, where Sterne's parents are having sex, and there is this reference to the alarm clock, which has to be screwed, so wound up. Therefore, once again, and obviously, uh, you know, uh, sort of digressive reference and sexual allusion. These two elements are very important. Tristram Shandy uses a lot of digressions and a lot of sexual allusions. So then Mrs. Shandy is about to give birth, and Walter Shandy and Toby Shandy, both of them, are sitting in the parlor, anxiously waiting for the birth of Tristram. Now, and they have called the obstetrician, Dr. Slop, who comes in, and as he is busy with Obadiah, the maid, in delivering Tristram, Walter Shandy and Toby Shandy have their own dialogues, their own stories to tell. Walter Shandy, for example, is a philosophus gloriosus who will talk abstractedly about philosophy and issues for hours. Toby is extremely sentimental, so he cannot even hurt a fly. So if there is a fly, he will pick it up, take it to the window and say, "Go, small creature, I cannot hurt thee." So the sentimental, naive. So on the one hand, the person who talks philosophy in every way, every turn, philosophus gloriosus, and you have the sentimental, naive, right? So in that sense, the person who is always sentimental about everything. Then, of course, Sterne's father wants, Tristram's father wants him to be named as Trismegistus, after a philosopher. Obadiah hears the name Tristram, and Tristram is coined as Tristram. Tristram in Latin means sad. Therefore, this is the event of Tristram's birth. As Tristram grows up, nothing really happens in the story. Widow Wadman falls in love with Toby, but wants to be sure where Toby has been wounded. There's a misunderstanding about it. And more importantly, one of the episodes is where the young Tristram, who is 2 or 3 years old, is peeing outside, is pissing outside from the window, and the window sash falls upon his nose. Now, there are oblique suggestions that it has fallen upon his penis, but Tristram hastens to add that by the nose, I mean the nose, the external organ of smelling, and nothing else. Right? So at every stage, there is a play on sexuality, and there are a few digressions. For example, the story of Love Fever, who dies, and there is a poignant moment when the sentimental death is sort of announced, and so on and so forth. Right? So, all in all, within the novel particularly, nothing really happens. Nothing really happens. But you see, there are important passages. For example, when Widow Wadman is described, Sterne says everybody has their own concept of beauty. So, reader, I am providing you with a blank page, and you actually have a blank page where you yourself write down the your definition or your description of the beautiful woman. Or for that matter, when there is the death of Le Fever, you actually have a black page symbolizing the unnarrativity or the non-narrativity of death. You have marbled pages, you have graphs which show how the progress of the novel takes place. You have chapters closing abruptly, opening abruptly. So, what are the challenges that Sterne is posing to the very concept of the novel? The first concept that he's challenging is the notion of plot and character. The notion of plot and character. Also, the notion of how a novel can be begun and ended. So, closures and openings, plots and characters. Then, of course, there is the challenge to the notion of a book. Then there are the challenges to the ideas of Locke, and we'll come to explaining what are the ideas of Locke that he challenges, and the ideas of sentimentality provoked by Hume. And finally, there are challenges to the notions of sexuality and the notions of language. So, over the next 2 or 3 lectures, what we are going to do is we're going to take sections. For example, tomorrow, I'm going to take a look at Sterne's treatment of plot, character, beginnings, and closures to see how the narrative format of the novel, of the realist novel, is being questioned by Sterne. Then we'll take another class on how philosophical assumptions of Locke and Hume are taken up by the novel. And then in a final lecture, we shall talk about how Sterne is posing challenges about the notion of the book, about language, and why sexuality becomes such a very important phenomenon for Lawrence Sterne. I think that is all for today. We've just introduced the novel to you, and over the next 3 lectures, we shall discuss the various questions and the various challenges that Sterne is throwing to his readers in this particular novel. Thank you for your patience. The next class in Tristram Shandy is tomorrow at 2:30. The next class on Tom Jones, the final class on Tom Jones, is tomorrow at 10:30. Hope that you will join me in these 2 classes. Thank you very much for your attention.